Good morning. Welcome to Daily Focus, and I'm glad that you have joined me once again this morning. And we'll be in Proverbs chapter 11 once again and looking through the rest of this chapter. We're kind of going to pick and choose our way through as many of the verses deal with things that we have dealt with quite a bit. But I want to start with one of the verses that's very familiar. Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. And so in verse number 14, God is teaching us that we ought to look for wise counsel. This morning in my devotions, I was reading the account of Rehoboam as now the king of Israel, taking over for Solomon, who had been greatly blessed of God, and the nation had thrived and reached its pinnacle of both economic status as well as military status and global status, if you will. And God had just really blessed. And as Rehoboam came on as the successor to his father's kingdom, the power went to his head. And he sought the advice from the older men, those who had counseled Solomon, and they said, serve the people, listen to the people, love the people, care for them, and they'll follow you. And but that did not feed his ego. That did not give him what he was looking for in his ego trip of power and position and prestige. And so he asked the guys he grew up with, how would you have me to rule, or what would you do if you were in my place? And they said, boy, I would just be a harsh taskmaster. I would tell them who's boss. I would show them. And if they don't do it, they're told, you know, where Solomon would have whipped them, you're going to use scorpions. And he listened to that because it fed his selfish, immature ego. And he just didn't get good advice. So it's not so much just looking for advice or counsel. It's looking to the right places. It's those that you've watched stay on the path of wisdom. Those are the ones that you want to get your counsel from. Those that have stepped off the path of wisdom to follow after all of these pursuits of foolishness that end in destruction, to get advice from people like that is to be foolish yourself. And so I think it's important as we jump into the rest of this chapter to see that God is reminding us that we're not only to be searching for wise counsel, we're to heed it. And so that's important. But really the rest of this passage is going to deal once again with that which is righteous, being blessed, and that which is wicked, producing death or consequences. And so verse number 17 says, the merciful man doeth good to his own soul, but he that is cruel troubleth his own flesh. The wicked worketh a deceitful work, but to him that soweth righteousness shall be a sure reward. As righteousness tendeth to life, so he that pursueth evil pursueth it to his own death. In verse number 21, though hand join in hand, the wicked shall not be unpunished, but the seed of the righteous shall be delivered. In verse number 25, the Bible says, the liberal soul shall be made fat. It's talking about the generous person, someone who's liberal or generous with that which has been entrusted to them. And it's not talking about someone who has a very leftist political view as a liberal. That is not what it's talking about. It's talking about a generous person. The liberal soul shall be made fat. And he that watereth shall be watered also himself. He that withholdeth corn, the people shall curse him. But blessing shall be upon the head of him that selleth it. He that diligently seeketh good procureth favor. But he that seeketh mischief, it shall come unto him. Verse number 30, the fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and he that winneth souls is wise. Behold, the righteous shall be recompensed in the earth, much more the wicked and the sinner. So God is reminding us here that we have a responsibility to be generous. And then he lays out some of those areas in which we can be generous. Verse number 17 talks about being generous with mercy. And the Bible teaches us that really being merciful to others actually ministers to our own soul. Well, there is nothing more detrimental to the health of a person than harboring bitterness and an unforgiving spirit. My favorite definition of bitterness is drinking poison and waiting for the other guy to die. But that's exactly what bitterness does. Showing mercy and having a forgiving spirit actually ministers to your own soul. It's a freeing experience. And God is saying, listen, we need to be generous with mercy. We need to be quick to forgive. And then the principle of sowing and reaping applies. Listen, there isn't any of us who are perfect. There isn't any of us that do not have selfish moments. And just as we extend mercy quickly, the sowing and reaping principle teaches us that we will then quickly be forgiven. And so those that are of an unforgiving spirit and hold bitterness easily will be treated the same way. And so God teaches us, listen, be generous with mercy. And then he talks about in verse number 21 that the wicked is not going to be unpunished, but the seed of the righteous shall be delivered. And we're to be generous with sowing seeds of righteousness. We ought to generously do the right thing. We ought to go over and above the effort to make sure that what we're doing is right and pure and just. And so God says, listen, we ought to be generous as it relates to doing right by people, doing right in situations. And then verses 25 and 26 really deal with being generous with our finances, being generous with our time, being generous with our talents. And it says the liberal soul will be made fat. In other words, God delights in blessing those who are generous. Now, let me just say a sidelight here. Remember the lesson, we are not to help irresponsible people. In other words, we're not to take the responsibility of the irresponsible that just helps them to be further irresponsible. The principle of being generous is not the same principle as enabling people to be irresponsible. But being generous means that I take what God has entrusted to me and I'm quick to share it. I'm quick to extend it in ways that glorify God and are a blessing and help to others. And when you help somebody be irresponsible, you're really not helping them. But when you are able to come alongside and help somebody be successful, you really are helping them. And we ought to be generous with what God has given to us in order for people to be successful. And then verse number 27, he that diligently seeketh good procureth favor. But he that seeketh mischief, it shall come unto him. The Bible is teaching us that we have this responsibility to make sure that we're doing good by people. And the previous verse 26 talks about not withholding corn. If you can feed somebody, feed them. If you can help somebody out of a ditch, help them out of the ditch. If you can help somebody secure a position at a job somewhere, help them do that. God says, you know what, that generous spirit not only is a blessing to them, it gets God's attention and he in turn blesses you. And so we don't do to get, that's selfish, but we ought to do in order to glorify God. And so my admonition from the text this morning is make sure we're being generous. Last thought, verse number 30. Let's remember to be generous with the gospel. We've been entrusted the gospel of Jesus Christ, the fact that he died, was buried, and he rose again. That gives hope to anyone who needs security for forever in heaven, to know their sins have been forgiven, completely paid for, that they have a home in heaven waiting for them, that their name is written in the book of life, and that their soul has been saved, and that they're a child of God. That all happens because of the gospel. Let's make sure we're generous in sharing the gospel. I trust that you'll have a great day. I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. God bless you.